All right, so we continue off our discussion of lecture series number 3, which is software project management. And in this lecture screencast, we're just going to finish off the last 2 remaining segments of the project planning unit, right? So we're just going to quickly run through this whole notion of software pricing to get a sense of different strategies that are used to price software. And then we'll quickly transition to look at a few estimation techniques that are used to figure out exactly how long a project would take, and also gain an approximate value of how much it would cost to undertake the project. And incidentally, after this discussion, hopefully some of the questions that came through from the most recent online interaction we had would probably be answered. I think somebody raised the question or a question to do with approximating the schedule of the project, right? This is all tied down to estimating how long a project will generally take. Suffice to say that for the projects that we're currently working on, obviously there's a predetermined timeline associated with the project. And then when it comes to the cost, obviously, there's certain assumptions that we are making here. Like, for instance, the developers would typically be working for free here. But perhaps as an exercise, maybe what we should do is just come up with hypothetical costs for the various projects that we're working on, just so we can work through some practical aspects of pricing and so estimation techniques associated with pricing and scheduling. I think that would be a nice exercise. So yeah, I think we set up yet another assignment that will allow you to kind of like work through some hypothetical examples of trying to estimate the price and the schedule, kind of. And I think the whole process will in part or should actually involve you making use of any project management tool of your choice to come up with this estimate. So what I mean here is, if you remember our discussion from the most recent interaction, I showcased a very nifty feature associated with Project Libre, where you get to specify resources associated with your project. So I think we'll do that actually. But right, so we'll start off with pricing here, right? So this whole notion of estimating a price is really done to enable you figure out exactly how much it's going to cost you as the developers of whatever system you might be working on. So how much it's going to cost you to develop the product. And more importantly, the total cost that will be incurred for you to produce the software system. So something else to think about here is whenever you're providing a service in life, you typically would want to make some sort of markup on top of the total cost associated with the project, right? So this is in part why estimating is important, right? You want to make sure that you come up with an estimate that's going to ensure that you make a reasonable profit from the endeavor itself. So there are a couple of things that you want to take into account as you're coming up with a price associated with software, right? You have to think about the materials, the tools, and the services that you're going to use, and any other costs that would be associated with the project. So this would be obvious things such as the hardware, right? Hardware infrastructure that you'd potentially end up using. Remember, when you're developing software, you're probably going to find yourself making use of server infrastructure, for instance. I mean, these days, this might perhaps involve you paying money to make use of cloud-based services, right? So you need software tools as well, right? This might involve you paying for licensing fees for certain commercial versions of software. So in the case of project management, for instance, perhaps your company might decide to say they're going to use Microsoft Project, in which case you need money, right? There's also costs associated with travel, right? Think about a kind of situation where you as a software development company is based in a town like Lusaka, but your client is on the Copper Belt. It's generally the case that you'd need to make frequent visits to your client premises, right? In which case you'd need to travel to the copper belt. Whether you decide to drive there or use public transportation is irrelevant. You'd still need money for you to travel, right? During the course of the project, it may be the case that certain individuals working on the project will need to undergo training, specialist training, right? All that costs money, right? So these are all different examples of activities that might involve considerable investment of money into the project, and so you need to take all these things into account. Right. So important point here to note is there isn't really a direct relationship between the total development cost and the price that you tend to charge to the client here. It turns out that there's a broad range of factors that you need to take into account as you're coming up with a software price. Right. So these factors include things like contractual terms, right, with the client that you're working with. So it could be the case that maybe your clients might be willing to allow you to retain copyright access to the source code, right? In which case you'd be able to reuse it in other projects, right? So potentially make more money from already developed software by just making minor changes or alterations. If this is the case, then it makes sense that you probably underprice the project because you know that you'd be able to make more money as you're working with other clients. So you also need to take into account uncertainties associated with the cost, right? So think of what's currently happening right now in Zambia. So this issue with the currency exchange rate, right? If some of these things that you're spending money on require that you make payments in currencies other than the one you commonly use, then it goes without saying that you need to potentially try and overprice or come up with an overpriced value for this software pricing or software cost. Something else to take into account is the overall financial health of the development company, right, that you work for. And really this is tied to the fact that in certain instances, all you'd be interested in is just to make a really small markup, right, on top of the overall cost associated with the project. And in certain rare instances, perhaps what you'd be interested in is just to break even, right? Make sure that you just don't lose any money. This is usually the case when you find yourself in a situation where you're just getting into a new market and you want to advertise your services, right? And really this is tied to this factor tagged as market opportunity, right? So you tend to lower the overall price of the software, right? So that you get a footing into this new market that you're getting into. All right, so there's other factors associated with change in requirements. So we had a discussion of how to cope with change here when we were discussing lecture series number 2, I believe. Right. So the idea behind this is that requirements are more likely to change, right? And so what you'd want to do is you might want to lower your price just so you can win a contract in the event that you are undergoing a bidding process where you're competing with other development companies or development firms. But what you would do is once the contract is awarded, then you'd obviously adjust the price depending on whether you have new requirements that are coming on from your clients or customers. All right, so in terms of strategies here, there's really two main strategies that you need to think about. So you can either underprice or you can increase the price, right? And again, to sum up some of the things we already mentioned here, you would be underpricing so that you win the bid, right? If you're bidding against other companies. You'd also underprice if you are interested in advertising your services or getting a footing into this new market that you're getting into. In terms of the increased price strategy here, what you'll be doing here is just increasing the price when you have a fixed price that's associated with a contract, to take into account unexpected risks. All right, so ideally, really, you want to, in an ideal case, you want to be able to price the software so that the people that you'd be working with, your clients, would be willing to pay money for the product, right? The last thing you'd want to do is to scare off potential clients here. If the amount of money required, or if the software price is far less than the total development cost associated with the project, then the likely thing to do would be to sort of like make alterations to the software project so that you remove some of the features associated with the software, right? So removing the features would mean reducing the development costs, right? The goal should always be to either break even or to at least be able to make a markup on top of the total development cost of the software project. And then obvious additional costs may be added as the requirements change, as you begin to understand more about the nature of the project you're working on. And this generally tends to happen as you are getting closer to finishing off the software project itself or finalizing the project itself, because by then your clients or customers would have gotten to a stage where they would fully appreciate the product that you're developing, right? So they would have bought into this whole idea of the functionality that is going to be exhibited by the project itself or the software. All right. So quickly on a few estimation techniques here, just wanted to start off by saying that the accuracy associated with estimation will tend to increase as you progress during the project lifecycle, right, or during the project timeline. So the initial estimates that you make, for instance, will not really be as accurate as the estimates that you're making midway through the project or somewhat closer to the finishing point of the project, right? So this is what we're trying to say in this diagram here. But I guess questions to ask here is why would it be important for you to estimate the project? Well, you want to make sure that you're in a position where you can make effective decisions, right? And some important decisions that you'd have to make is be able to determine if the project is worth undertaking in the first place, right? So when we're discussing software pricing previously, we brought up this notion of ensuring that you either break even or make some small little markup on top of the overall development cost, right? You'd be able to come up with an effective decision on whether to continue with the project only if you are able to estimate how much money you're going to make out of the project or how long it's going to take, right? So effective decision making. Then also project estimation is important because it gives you an idea of an accurate estimate. We're going in a loop here, but it gives you an idea of how long it would take for you to complete the project, right? And this is tied to the schedule here. So fundamentally what you'd be doing really is to approximate two main factors here. You want to approximate how much it's going to cost you and how long it's going to take you, right? But also in the process, what you're doing really is trying to come up with some sort of baseline that you're going to use as a basis to monitor the project. Remember that this whole notion of planning is a continuous process. And so what you need to do is to come up with baseline metrics that you're going to do to continuously monitor a project, right? And you do this early on during the project lifecycle. So there are a number of techniques that I use to estimate cost and project schedules. But of these, two of them are popular, right? So there's the experience-based technique and algorithmic cost modeling technique, right? So in the experience-based technique, what we'll be doing is using analogies, right, to try and estimate exactly how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost you to undertake the project. This would generally involve a bit of experience, right? So a project manager will typically use past experience to try and approximate exactly how long it's going to take to undertake the project, or how much it's going to take to undertake the project. So think of it from a perspective of this software manager who has managed a project that involves developing an LMS, for instance. So undertaking a similar project would be trivial for this project manager because he or she would already have experience working on that sort of software artifact or product. So the algorithmic cost modeling technique would typically involve using statistical methods or maths to try and compute the cost and the relative schedule of the project, or approximate schedule and cost of the project, right? And typically what happens here is you use easy to measure metrics like the relative size of the project. So size could take the form of, let's say, the potential lines of code that would be associated with the software that you're developing, for instance. The number of people that you need to hire to be part of the project, the developers that you need to hire, the sort of experience that they have, right? The number of, or the types of components, software components that are going to be associated with the project. Are you going to find yourself in a situation where you need to implement an API? Is this a web-based application where you need maybe browser plugins or something? But besides the process of using analogies and statistical techniques, you can also take advantage of so-called engineering-based approaches and actual cost approaches. So in the engineering-based approach, what you do is you take a bottom-up approach where you break down the project into smaller manageable components, and then you determine, or you try and approximate the cost associated with those different components. After you do that, you add up the cost, and then you come up with a relatively accurate estimate of how much the project would cost. You do the same thing for the schedule, right? You break down the project into smaller manageable components, and then you derive timelines associated with those different packages and components. A combination of those different approximations will give you a relative estimate of how long the project is going to take. The actual cost approach is somewhat different here. What you'd be doing is making use of information that you have associated with an already completed product, right? So you use cost and schedule details associated with this completed product to be able to approximate how long the current project will take, right? And how long the current project will cost you. What you realize here is that the last method would probably be appropriate in instances where you have experience developing projects, right? So if we're to relate this to the projects that we're currently working on, obviously this technique wouldn't really be appropriate. The engineering-based approach would probably be ideal, right? All right, so in terms of trying to look at maybe things like the pros and cons associated with these 4 different approaches we just spoke about, if you think about it, when it comes to the process of using analogies, you realize that this is heavily dependent on subjective views coming in from the people working on the project. In this case, it would be the people managing the project, right? And obviously, anything to do with anything that is subjective in nature is generally not going to be very accurate. Right? It will give you a reasonable estimate, but it won't be as accurate as something that is more objective. All right, so what you do is you identify the deliverable, obviously, to be produced in the project, and then different components associated with the system. So this approach, though, the approach that makes use of analogies would typically be more accurate if you get a number of people to be involved in the overestimation process. All right. So the difficulty, though, with this technique is that a new software project may not have much in common with previous projects that the project manager would have worked on. And then just a few examples here. Obviously, when it comes to software, seeing as we're dealing with technology changes pretty quickly. So a project that you probably were a part of 5 years ago might be extremely difficult from a similar project that you're working on right now, just because the technology from 5 years ago is completely different from what's currently being used right now. So if you haven't really worked with these technologies in your previous, or if you didn't work with some of the technologies you're potentially working with currently on previous projects, then they won't really be that helpful in helping you estimate project cost and schedules. Okay, so the statistical techniques will typically involve you making use of easy to measure metrics. Like I said, I gave examples of lines of code. I mean, it happens to be one of those most widely used metric in most of these algorithmic cost models, right? But typically the estimation is typically done using formulas similar to this, right? And this is just an example. It's not like these techniques would typically use this formula per se. This is just trying to give us an idea of how the costing is done. And incidentally, we were going to have a discussion on the Kokomo model, but we decided to leave it out. Maybe we can do that as an exercise to gain a sense of how algorithmic cost modeling would be conducted or done. But anyway, so if you look at this formula, A would be some constant that is dependent to the organization, right? So the development firm in this case, and then the B would reflect the relative effort for large projects, right? And then M is just some factor that is used to compound the result that you're getting from A when multiplied by size. Again, irrespective of what algorithmic cost modeling technique that you're using, it's almost always the case that the number of lines of code or the code base size would be incorporated into the formula, right? Just because it happens to be a very important factor. Remember, you're developing software, right? Software is typically associated with lines of code. All right, so again, there are several factors that will influence these statistical methods, right? So things like the use of reusable components, the type of programming language that you're using, right? So perhaps the influence of lines of code might not really be that much if you're using JavaScript, but it may be significant if you're using a language like C or C++, just because it's not as intuitive. All right, and so as the development process progresses, obviously, like we said, the approximation becomes more accurate, right? So this graph actually is applicable to all these different methods, estimation techniques that we just discussed. All right, so the algorithmic cost modeling techniques obviously will give you a more systematic way of estimating the effort that would be required, obviously, but they're not that easy to work with. You generally need to have people that are competent in trying to come up with approximations using these techniques. Also, there are usually a number of attributes that you need to factor in or take into account. And really, the complexity usually arises due to the fact that if you're wanting to exclude certain components from the software, that certain components from the software that you're developing, then what that would entail is that you'd have to recompute or really rework the algorithm that you're working with, or the statistical method that you're working with. You typically, as you're reading up, you typically discover that these sort of techniques are more utilized in instances where mission critical systems are being developed, right? So companies that are in the business of developing software that is used in aeroplanes, for instance, or software that is used in the health sector, for instance, right? Software that is used to make important decisions, let's say in the financial sector, for instance, or banking sector. All right, so in terms of the bottom-up or the engineering-based approach here, like I said, it's slightly more detailed because what you're doing is you're taking a bottom-up approach where you're breaking up the entire project into smaller components that are associated with the project. But obviously, because you're breaking it up into smaller components, what that means is a lot of effort will typically be required for you to come up with approximate costs and schedules associated with those smaller components. Now, I know it's hard to understand here, especially that the only reference point we currently have right now are these so-called mini projects that we're working on, right? But in the real world, you'd be working towards developing complex software. Breaking up that complex software into smaller components that you later on approximate is not an easy feat. It is expensive because you need more people to do that. And it also takes a lot of time, right? So these are all, I guess, pros and cons associated with these different techniques. And so you'd have to decide on which technique to adopt depending on the domain within which you're working on and the complexity of the project, obviously. But compared with the experience-based method, obviously, you notice that this bottom-up engineering approach is similar to the statistical approach or the parametric approach in that it's less subjective, right? Because it's less subjective, you are more likely to arrive at a cost that is much, much closer to the actual cost. So this in fact is similar to this. It's a much more reliable way of arriving at an accurate estimate of the project. All right, and then the last technique that we discussed was the actual cost technique, where you're more or less using a technique that will allow you to get a much closer estimate to the actual cost of the project. And like mentioned previously, this is because you are using information, or the information that you're using to arrive at the cost is based on past projects that you've worked on, actual numbers that are associated with past projects, right? So you typically need a database that has details of the type of project that you worked on, the domain associated with the project, things like the number of people that worked on that project, right? So using all those different variables or attributes, you'd be able to really come up with an actual cost estimate or schedule estimate associated with the current project. Again, as earlier mentioned, this only works if you've already built a similar application in a similar domain. Right? All right, just to kind of recap project planning, we mostly focused on introducing this whole notion of plan-driven development. And we also made mention of the fact that during our discussion of agile development techniques, we'll look at agile planning when undertaking or leveraging an agile-based technique, right? Development technique. And then we had a thorough discussion of project scheduling, and then just wrapped up by looking at software pricing and a number of estimation techniques. So in the next unit, we are going to just briefly look at risk management. Thank you.